All right, well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining. My name is Johnny Thomas. I am a program manager. I work on the product team here at Excel. I'm pretty recently joining the product team. Prior to that, I had a bunch of different roles here at Microsoft, including a little under 10 years in our finance organization, doing lots of different roles under financial planning and analysis, controllership, so a lot of experience, a lot of time just kind of sitting and working in Excel every day. And my time in those type of roles really kind of coincided with a little bit of a revolution in the kind of power that we were putting into the Excel product, and I think you all have witnessed that. So things like being able to do more rows, and then the dawn of the power tools, PowerQuery, Power Product, or PowerPivot, all of that made my life so much easier. I was able to do so much more as a financial analyst, and it made me kind of want to join the revolution, so to speak, and that's how I made my way over to the Excel product team. But what we're going to be talking about today is actually the revenue planning process here at Microsoft and how these tools helped our finance team get their job done better. So really quickly, going to run through revenue planning here at Microsoft, what the difficulties are that we've had, and how Excel and modern Excel really helped us get the ball rolling and do more in our jobs. The one thing I do want to land here, though, is that this isn't the story of how Microsoft planning is done, period, right? It's a big company. There's lots of different ways to get things done. This is one of like hundreds of solutions that exist. And part of the reason so many solutions can exist is that there's so much analytical power that exists at the analyst level. That I don't need to have an IT pro doing stuff for me. I've got Excel, I've got PowerQuery, I've got PowerPivot, I can post things out to Power BI. I've got enough power myself as an analyst in my own little world that I can create a solution that works for me, and the person next to me can do the same. So the quick rundown on revenue planning at Microsoft. Every quarter we'll do some sort of financial planning. Once a year we're setting a budget, is what we'll call it, but it's essentially a sales target. And then intermittently throughout the year we'll do forecasts. We'll do updates to where we think we're going to land relative to that target. Depending on the team, it might be every quarter, but there are situations where it might be every month, it might be every week. If you're doing product planning for something like Surface or a phone, and what you think you're going to do in sales has a material impact on how much we need to build, you need to do those forecasts more often and make sure that we're getting the product built on time so that we can actually sell it. Planning is also done across a lot of different dimensions. There's geographies, different product sets, different customer segments. These are all part of the planning exercise that an analyst has to run through. And what all these dimensions means is that pretty quickly your data blows up, right? You go from needing to do one simple forecast in theory to having to produce a few thousand data points to represent that forecast. So how that looks like for us. We have what we call a little bit of a planning cascade. We'll start at a worldwide level, corporate level, high-level business strategy, overall direction of the company, and maybe some key investments on where we're headed as a company. And that starts to what we call cascade, down a hierarchy. So we'll go to areas in our world, then to locations, which are a subset of that area. And then you might get to product teams in a location, right? And I worked in a few different locations, so to speak, both in the US, just actually across the street here, to Germany. And there's definitely some differences in how you approach things and some common threads. But the key here is that as you move down this cascade, there's more and more data. Like there's more and more information that you're trying to inject. Because as you get deeper and deeper and deeper and you're getting closer to that sort of sales execution, how you're going to actually land the plan, there is a lot more dimensions and elements that need to get into it. And actually the next step below this is where we go into what we call our quota process. You're actually trying to figure out at an individual seller or at a team level how much sales they need to land in a given year if we're going to land the target that exists up at that worldwide level. So down at the analyst level is where the budgets are getting built, and then they're flowing all the way back up to create an overall company picture. You're setting targets, and then like I said, intermittently you're updating that forecast. So at the lowest level you have a lot of granularity, and that all sort of has to bubble up. So I think the natural sort of question is, can't there be IT tools to do this, right? This is a huge company. You've got over 1,000 finance professionals. You've got a large IT department. You're sort of working towards a common goal. Why don't IT tools exist for this? The truth is that they do, somewhat. You know, their IT tools are really, really good at getting us up that chain. Good for consolidation, good for bubbling things up till we get to a common language, a common speak for the company. But they're a little bit tougher at doing the lower level granular planning process. And part of the reason for that is everyone sort of has a different approach, in a different view, in a different business, in a different market. It's not really likely that the Office team in Brazil thinks about FY16 the way the Xbox team in Japan does. And so naturally, different teams, different groups with different responsibilities all have a different approach that they want to take. And what's important here is to think about, as we're moving up and down these levels, it's not just about how much data you need to manage and what the data points are. There's also a point about accountability. You know, people want to drill into the details because we're trying to get specific and prescriptive about what's our execution plan. How are we going to meet company goals? And so the Western Europe lead might think that they need to know a lot about what Italy is saying if the Italy lead is saying they don't think they can make their goal. They want to drill in and understand, well, why don't you think that? What's going on in the market? Maybe they get convinced. Maybe they have to push back a little harder. Maybe they think they need to go then talk to Spain and see if Spain can just help out Western Europe hit their goal so that the worldwide group can meet their goal. So the idea is the local teams are the ones that are managing all their analytics. They're the ones that need to build their products. They're the ones that need to build the tools. That's a challenge. So there's a lot of work to do. Like I mentioned, as you move down the layer, you have more dimensions, more data points to create. Simple example here, but if you're doing 10 products, you want to do 10 forecasts, and then you have 10 different versions of that product, suddenly it's 100 forecasts. If you have different customer segments you want to look at, that blows up. If you're thinking about different geographies, you know, I worked in the United States for a little while, and we actually subdivide the US into 10 different districts. So suddenly our simple forecast just for the United States is actually 10 different geographies. And we're forecasting for a year, which means that it's 12 months. It's not just 1 year, one data point. And there's a lot of different approaches to consider, right? You're doing a lot of different forecasting. It's not like you are going to sit there and prescriptively land every single data point. You're going to think about what are the most important businesses, what are the biggest trends. And so you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of focus there. But then you also need to intelligently do the rest, which means you've got to do budget modeling or forecast modeling that can handle lots of different approaches. That's another piece where maybe a general IT tool might not be able to help you so much. There's a lot of historical data to understand, right? We're producing a lot of data points, but you don't sort of put a blindfold on and then just go out and forecast. You're always going to be looking at historical data, trying to look for trends, see what you can learn from the past to look out onto the future. And then there's a lot to investigate, right? In total, you have a ton of data points you're dealing with. You don't know the story behind each of them. As you go through the process, as you're trying to figure out what you're going to do for the future, new stories, new ideas might pop out. You might want to drill down. You don't really know where that's going to happen before you start doing the work. And more importantly, there's a lot of insight that you want to deliver, right? Doing a forecast, doing a budget, helping out figure sales targets isn't about producing data, right? It's not just about a data point. It's about figuring out what the data is telling us. What's the business story going on? Why do we think, or why do we have the expectations that we do for the next year? And that's really where most of the analysts want to spend their time. If you're constantly working on scrubbing data or just building out models, you're not going to look at the trends. You're not going to come up with key performance indicators. You're not going to inject that market-specific knowledge, which is really what you want to do to drive a story home, to help be a productive part of the overall process that we're running within the company. And another important part is the data is still an important part of the analyst's job, right? They're the bringers of the truth, so they've got to be the bridge between the data to the action. That means they've got to be able to really quickly move between being down in the weeds or jumping up to a 20,000-foot level because they're having an executive-level conversation about what investments you might need to make from a marketing perspective or from a sales strategy perspective and how we want to align teams. They've got to flow back and forth between those different movements. I spent some time as a marketing controller here in the company, and one of the areas where I found most successful is where I could go have a conversation with one specific marketer about the campaign they were running and how they were tracking against their budget and how we could get more efficient with their budget, and then immediately turn around and talk to the CFO of our area about the overall marketing experience, what our trends were, and how we could get more efficient, and never change workbooks, right? I was going back and forth without any problem. And that's what some of the more advanced tools that we've injected into Excel have helped more analysts do without getting help from anyone else. They can sort of own and manage it themselves. And that's really the important part, right? The IT can't really do all this. There isn't scale for IT to be working with every single analyst that might be working at the bottom of that cascade. You don't have a one-to-one IT and financial analyst ratio. The IT tools can be really great at helping you get the data together, helping you with a reporting infrastructure so that you can figure out what that historical information is, or helping you with those consolidation tools. But like I said, business markets vary, and so you want the analysts to be able to inject their own insight, and that's tough to do at scale across the company for the IT department. There's also time, right? These tools that you're going to build, doing the financial analysis, they all take time, and it's an iterative process. If you're constantly going to be doing like spec writing, doing reviews, and then testing the tools, finding out what's wrong, revising the spec, doing a new review, doing new testing, there's no time for that to really happen. You'll find yourself pretty quickly stuck in the middle of the process, or trying to hit a deadline without any of the tools that you need to get there. And that's not IT's fault or the analyst's fault. There's a natural divide that exists. IT's got to teach the analyst about what is possible, what is capable, what are the tools available. The analyst is trying to teach about the business. And that's a communication gap that is great to bridge, but is time consuming to do. And quite frankly, no one has that time. Finally, there's agility, right? It's really important to be able to adjust and keep the process moving as you learn more. Mike Tyson once said, like, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's kind of how a lot of this planning can go sometimes. You can do all the advanced planning you want to do lots of scrubbing, then you start working in the data, learning new things going on in the market, and suddenly you need to adjust, right? You're truly building a plane while it's in flight. And yes, you learn each time, and you try and leverage as much as you can from the past, but there's always adjustments to make. And so that means there isn't much of a runway for sort of the cross-team collaboration and iteration that often has to happen if you're working with IT. And all of these get amplified when you have a bigger gap between who's the business expert and who's the tool expert. And so that's where Excel can really help, because wouldn't it be great if you merge them so that it's the same person? So all those issues we have around scale, around time, around agility can get reduced at least, because the analyst, the one with the business expertise, the one who's going to be doing the final financial planning, the final process of forecasting, is the one that's also developing the tool, because things like PowerQuery, PowerPivot, they're at their disposal to get things done faster. Charts, Power BI, all make the visualizations easier to have those executive level conversations. And so, in fact, it makes life a lot easier for the analyst, because they're the ones that can get things done. They're the one sort of in control of their own fate. And I've seen it happen across the company many times, that you sort of have this situation where a few people start dabbling in some of these later tools that we've had, the PowerQueries, the PowerPivots, and they pretty quickly realize their life's gotten a lot easier. They can get more done. They can get it done in shorter time. They start talking about it with their coworkers, the person at the desk next to them. And suddenly it goes a little viral, where someone starts as a dabbler, they get into it, and they sort of hit this phase where they've got a hammer in these tools, and now everything's a nail that they can just go crush with these new tools that they've got. Other people see it happening, they start dabbling, and so on and so forth. We pretty quickly had a situation where we had users who were getting a lot done, piquing the interests of others, and we had a little community develop pretty quickly where we started doing, peer trainings and peer sessions to help everyone get up on board, to the point that a year later, where we had maybe a handful of people doing things themselves as opposed to trying to get some technical support from some dedicated IT staff, to a year later, everyone just doing it themselves because they saw it was much easier and far less hassle to get the job done. So what I want to do actually is now spend a lot more time actually in Excel. We'll use some of these tools and kind of walk through how a process can get built up. And we'll literally start with a blank workbook and kind of work our way there. So I'm going to generalize this a little bit. In theory, the idea is the same of how we would have been approaching it, or how I was approaching it at least in my financial planning job at Microsoft. But we'll change it a little bit and talk about a different product in a different scenario. So we've got a fashion manufacturer who works with a lot of different products, right? T-shirts, pants, jeans, whatever we want to call it. They work in different colors. They've got different customer programs, paths to selling. They've got those 10 sales districts, and they're trying to do a forecast for the next year. So 1 year alone is 60,000 data points. If they want to analyze 3 years of history, another 180,000. If we want to make that five years of history, it blows up a little bit more. So the point is you've got a few 100,000 data points you've got to work with, and you can do that all within Excel. Let me switch over. Okay, so here we're looking at just a flat, boring data table, 180,000 rows. So this is intended to represent our historical data, right? This is, you could think of it as information coming out of a financial, an IT-driven financial system as a way to look at historical information. At Microsoft, we have one of these that gives you the option to either export things to a pivot, to a flat table like this, to an Access database. Actually now, within the last year, IT updated it so you can have the tool push things directly into PowerPivot, which has made life a little bit easier for us. But the idea is you've got data sitting somewhere, and you need to go drag it and pull it into a data model. So as I walk through some of these steps, you're going to see, we'll look at some like level 100 stuff in terms of using PowerPivot, PowerQuery, and I'll get into a little bit more advanced as we jump along the way. So here I just opened a blank workbook, and I want to go and drag that historical data into our new model, because we're trying to build a business model. And if I just opened up PowerPivot, the data model here, what you got is a blank screen, which for some people can be pretty intimidating, right? There's nothing to work with there. How do you get the data in? There's no way for me to come down here and see a blank sheet or right-click and add a new tab. We need to get data into the model. There are lots of different ways to do that. Starting with 2010, you can use the data connections. With PowerQuery, life got a lot easier. Now in 2016, it's built into the product, so it's super easy. So I just went over to the data tab. Now we've got a little get and transform section here in 2016, which is essentially PowerQuery built natively into the product. And I want to get new data. Lots of different options. You can see the different sources from Azure, different databases. We even have like non-Microsoft resources. We understand there are lots of different options for how you got information. But for the sake of this, I've got a file, a CSV that's sitting out on my computer that my actuals are here. So I went, navigated, imported it, and that's it, right? Now there's data in my model. I've got 180,000 rows I've just added to a data model. I go and click load. I can choose to drop it into a worksheet, or I could add it directly to the PowerPivot model. Let's get this screen cleaned up. So 180,000 rows right there. Now this just happened to be our 3 years of data, right? PowerPivot can handle a few million rows of data. Actually, when they did the demo at the keynote ceremony, and you saw the guy coming out there, Olaf, talking about the different features of Excel, he was working with a data set of 5 million rows. And you can go even further than that. I've limited it here just so you don't have to spend time watching things refresh as we walk through this process. But what's important to note here is how easy was that we've got data here in the model. If we jump back, we see it's all 180,000 rows there. It's there ready for us to filter and work with. And another cool thing that I don't think necessarily we talk about too much is, see if I can save this. Isn't that always the way? So book one was what I saved, actually, the 180,000 rows. And I'll pop that back open and let it go. What I wanted to show you there was book one is 2.5 gigs, or 2.5 megabytes. Yeah. Book 1 is 2 or 3 megs, and what it's got inside it is 12.5 megs of data, our original data source, our CSV. And I'll open up the PowerPivot window again just to prove it is actually there. So there's one thing we don't really talk about a lot is the power of the compression of PowerPivot as well. So that makes life a lot easier in another way for analysts in that you can do things in a lot more self-contained way. So if you think about, I didn't live in the exact same financial analyst role for 10 years. I was changing and different people were taking over for me. This makes life a lot easier when you're talking about passing things over to the next person and not losing some of the tribal knowledge that a lot of times exists in these different roles. You can keep getting work done. Another nice thing is that means sometimes a big complex model is sitting compactly in a single file that you can share out more easily if you don't necessarily have a share that's easy to drop to. These are things where you wouldn't normally think of adding 180,000 rows or a few 100,000 or a million rows to an email attachment, but no problem to do now. So let's jump ahead a little bit. I'll go to a new tab here, or a new file here. Again, we've got the 180,000 rows, the actual data we just looked at. And we've got the different perspectives. We're looking at different product types, whatever we want to call it. We've also got months in here, right? And how often has this happened? I don't know about you, but months alphabetically ordered I don't find particularly useful. It's impossible to get at different years or different quarters. Of course, Excel, you can do a sorting and it's smart enough to recognize these are months and at least get you into chronological order. But this is still a little bit clunky for me. PowerPivot's made that a lot easier for us, right? If you had this as a main data pool, one of the ways you might address this is you'll build a little table that says, well, what year is July 2012 a part of? For Microsoft, that's actually part of our fiscal year 13. We're on an adjusted schedule. So you'd build out this map, you'd go into the raw data of your pivot and do like a VLOOKUP or an index match so that you could get all of these months adjusted into your corporate calendar or add things like a quarter or a fiscal year. Way easier in PowerPivot. So just like I had loaded the actuals into this table, I loaded a little timetable. Looks a little daunting at first, but really pretty simple. It's got the months, the way they get spit out from our financial system, and then I've added a hierarchy to it. So I can see quarters, I can see years, I can do some calculations on it. And honestly, you build this once. And then as you continue to build models, you realize there are more places where you need it, and you just copy it over to the next spot. So it's super easy to maintain, and it's really, really easy to use. So rather than grab this fiscal month, let me go ahead and look at our timetable that we just looked at and say we want to add this to the table. Actually, let's get a little bit of a cleaner view here. So it's kind of garbage information. Excel doesn't, these tables aren't connected, and so Excel is saying every row, every single data point applies to every part of my time, which isn't really useful. But if we look over to the left on the yellow there, Excel is saying, hey, I think there's a relationship between them. You click auto detect and suddenly you've got clean data. You've got a custom calendar, the fiscal calendar for Microsoft applied here so that I know that my FY15 actually starts in July of 24, my Q2 ends in December, all that great stuff. And if I go back over to my PowerPivot model and look at the diagram view, what I'll see is I've got a one-to-many relationship on our fiscal month field. Now, everything I'm doing with this time, any manipulations I do, any hierarchies I build, get applied to my actuals table. So in the past, it would have been you do a bunch of VLOOKUPs on your raw data. Then when PowerPivot got introduced, 2010, you were able to do these visual line drawings, build relationships just like you would with a relational database. Now in 2016, Excel is smart enough to just draw those lines for you. So we'll keep moving a little bit. So I want to take a little bit of a diversion, right? So we're trying to build a model. There's a lot we want to inject into it. So all we've accomplished so far is we've got actuals in it. And now we've figured out how to apply different perspective, different hierarchies to those actuals. Now we actually need to get to the data. A lot of times for the first thing to do is actually sort of build a data template. So here I've kind of shrunk it down a little bit, just trying to think of, we need to figure out a template that we can use to then start adding data points, doing our forecasts. So here's an example where I've got the products we're looking at, colors we're looking at, sales channel we look at. There are a lot more different hierarchies. But like I said, it makes the data blow up. So I don't know if you've ever come into the situation, but this was a constant issue for me. Suddenly now, if I wanted to build a template, I had to go and figure out a way to come up with different counters to say, okay, assign the number 1 to mean the loyalty new customer, or the number 1 to mean black. Now I've got to come up with a way to make numbers rotate as I need, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the colors, I need the first 5 to all be 1, all be 2. The idea being, all I'm trying to do is get numbers to represent the actual products or dimensions that I'm interested in, so that I can then do VLOOKUPs or index matches. And so in effect, I've got 7 columns here, probably 10 different formulas, and all I'm really accomplishing is getting a template together. I haven't even gotten to actually doing any real forecasting, and do that for a few 100,000 rows, and already my workbook is starting to slow down. This is another sort of quick win that you can get with PowerPivot. So I'll open up the data model just a second just to kind of show you what we're looking at. And we've got these unrelated tables here, right? One for each dimension that we just looked at. And whereas we saw before, when we didn't have any relationship between the tables, we dragged in time and we saw that the same data got applied every single point. All that's really doing is, when there aren't relationships between the data, PowerPivot thinks every single point in one table applies to every single point in another. And effectively, what you've got are combinations, or the ability to make lots of different combinations really quickly. So here we've got a pivot that is hooked up to our PowerPivot model. And instead of having to do all the formulas and build out all these indexes and numbers, we can just click, 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 and get all those combinations built out. So suddenly, I've got my data template built by PowerPivot, and I didn't have to do lots of different formulas, lots of different complex things. I can just take a copy and paste of this auto-created template from PowerPivot, and now I'm ready to run. We don't need to see that. So great. We got our actuals in, we got a forecast template in, but we haven't really gotten to the meat of the product. So this is where we start to get into a little bit more of the interesting pieces. I've got maybe a different planning option for all the different files, all the different products that I'm going to be working on. So here's an example. I take my T-shirts. And you saw in the keynote demo, Olaf showed this to you. In Excel 2016, you can go do that forecast sheet, and it automatically produces a nice little forecast for you. But probably what's more important, or what's more useful, is that the forecast itself is a formula that you can leverage in Excel, right? Just as you would any other. So it becomes one of many tools you could use in a forecasting process. So for me, this becomes something a little bit more native to how I might do forecasting, and it's obviously we're a pretty numbers-driven company. So something along those lines might look familiar to you as well, right? You have these bright yellow cells that are saying these are going to be user inputs that I'm going to play around with, but I might have some other metrics that I'm interested in, things like year-over-year growth or a 3-year average on growth. And these are the points that, as I play with my numbers, I want to see them adjust. And this might be what I'm using to have a conversation with my T-shirt sales lead or my T-shirt product lead as we sit down together and think about, well, how can we figure out what we should be targeting for the next year? And so having something like forecast, the auto forecast, as one of many tools that are at your fingertips is useful, right? You can be one way to look at it. We can take the auto seasonality from Excel. We can ignore the seasonality and maybe do something linear, which looks less attractive, or we can do our own options. I think anyone who's done financial modeling and forecasting has sort of played around with all these different options. But the whole point is, you can take something automatically created and then say, yes, this is what I want to run with. I'll copy that and put that here as my main goal or as my target. And so, just base values there. And then maybe I want to tweak it, right? Maybe July, I think, should be $20,000 for this perspective. And now I have a model. This is, or now I have my forecast for one little slice of the big goal that I'm trying to get after, which is great for this one little slice with kind of two main problems. First, this was a nice and easy way to look at the data, represent it, figure out what I'm doing, and have a conversation with other people. It's not super conducive to getting things into a model to do more data manipulation and really sort of blow out my data set. The other issue is this was one file. I need to do this a few times. So I think probably a lot of people have had experience where you have data that looks like this. Either you set up a table this way, or someone has sent you a table, and you need to get it into a more digestible form. That's another spot where PowerQuery really shines, right? So just like we grab data from a table, or from a file, we can grab it from a table here. So PowerQuery is going to go load in this table that I have set up, the yellow cells we were looking at, but I see a few issues already, right? The July, August, September, these abbreviated names were kind of helpful when I'm looking at a table or trying to talk with others. But when I actually want to start loading this into the data set, I need to have a little bit more detail on what month I'm talking about. It's not just July, it's July of a specific year. So I had that hidden row below it where I had the real years, the real exact month name as it might appear in a financial reporting system. So I can use PowerPivot, or PowerQuery rather, and say, actually, I want to make those the names of my columns. Then I want to come over here and say, okay, actually, our all purchase types was just a total line. It was a tally, which was helpful, again, when I'm trying to build out my forecast. But when I'm trying to load information into a data model, totals are repetitive. They're not useful and can actually mean I'm double counting. So let me just pull it out. The same goes for our quarters and our full year numbers. Again, all really, really helpful to say, what am I forecasting for the full year? What am I forecasting for a quarter? What are my plans as I'm playing in the yellow cells? Not super useful when I'm trying to shove them into my data model and put them in perspective with other pieces of financial data. So I can also just pull those out of my model. So now I've got a nice, simple table that's got the core data points I want, except for one glaring problem, which is I have 12 columns of data. And ideally, you like to have one column of data, right? How many times does someone send you a copy of a table, a copy of a pivot, when you know they had the raw data there behind you, which would have made your life so much easier? What would be nice is if there was a way to simply flip those over. So unpivot is one of the most useful things I think anyone has in PowerQuery, a quick way to flip their data over. Now this is really utilized, or really in a spot where I can quickly manipulate it. So I might change the names here to fiscal month or to value. Let me get out of here. But the point is that this would now be something that I could load into my data model and be ready to run. I can get my queries to show up. And again, as we update those yellow cells, we want to change it, we could just kind of double-click refresh and update them. But PowerQuery is also doing something else in the background, which is it's recording what you're doing along the way, and it's generating the actual M code, right? And I think you maybe have heard this in other sessions when you talk about PowerQuery, the M code. That's a single platform that's being used across Excel and across Power BI as well. So as you learn one, you learn the other. This code gets generated without me trying to figure out what it all means. But actually, a little bit of an advanced step, one really nice thing is you can turn your Power Queries into functions and make them even more repeatable. So this doesn't have to just be steps that I apply to this particular product input table. I could go ahead and make this its own function. And I'll say it uses some sort of user input. And rather than go after a table called product input, we'll ask the user what they want. Just got to name it again. So now, rather than steps of a table, what I've got is a function. And to invoke that function, I click in and I say, well, let's just happen to run it on the product input tab because that's what I've got, right? And there it is. You can see it's the exact same data set we're working with. There's that 20,000 we manually punched in. But now I've got a little function I can play with. And you can take that to another level, right? This was how I worked with my t-shirt lead. But I've got 10 products that I'm going to be working with. So I might be having the exact same conversation with my belts lead, with my pants lead, with my shirts lead. And now I've got to consolidate all those different files together. This is another spot where PowerQuery makes life a little bit easier. I don't have to go into each file, do a copy and paste, get them all in one spot. I can rely on PowerQuery to help me out. So just like you can pull from lots of different data points, you can pull from a folder, or you could pull from a SharePoint site. So I could have a spot out there where I've got lots of different files, lots of different conversations I'm having with different product leads. And then when I want to bring everything together, I can just work with PowerQuery to get that data pulled in. So now what I'm doing in PowerQuery is I'm looking at pulling in a folders data. And this is what returns. You see I've got names of all the different files in there. And this works with all files. It doesn't necessarily have to be an Excel file or a Microsoft-based file. But it's going to read the folder and get a lot of key information out of there. The one I'm most interested in actually is the content. So it says binary there. What it is it's the file data itself. That's something that can be accessed. And so what I can do is add a new column to this table called product input, or whatever we want to call it. And I'll use that PowerQuery formula or function that we had just created. Now previously we had it taking in a name. Now I've got it set up to actually take in a file, an actual file from Excel, and it's going to assume that it's laid out in a certain way, that it's got a table in that file somewhere that's called product input, that I want to do all those manipulation steps to, promote the headers, take out some of the rows, take out some of the columns, do the unpivoting. But the point is, I've turned that into a function that was willing to do that on any old Excel file, or at least try to do that. So what I get is a new column added at the end that is the product input column. And if I go down here to my last row, which is my t-shirt file that we just looked at, and I clicked into this table, what I'd see is it's running through those steps, and it's doing that exact same manipulation that we did before. Again, you see that 20,000 that we had manually entered in. So the point is, I've now got an automated way to do this for many files. And the reality is when I read in this folder, all I really cared about was that one little yellow table. I don't care about any other information from this folder. So let me get rid of those columns and say, hey, let me just expand this one column, because this has got the information I want. So I just did a consolidated 10 files all from one folder using that Excel function. And this is what's ready to go for me to actually have a basis for my forecast built in to Excel, built into my data model just to load the exact same way. Now I've already got this set up so that we've got the queries in there. We've got the product data in there. But that was one dimension, right? The point I had made was, as the financial analyst, what you might want to do is focus on what's really important and then use some sort of smart way, an analytical horsepower, a way of getting at all the other details you need to produce, but you're not really, don't really have the time to focus in on. That's a little bit how this approach works. We have this product input as a way of doing our detailed conversations with our product leads. Then we might grab historical information to come up with how we might split that product forecast into different geographies, right? And this is normal Excel. You can do all the things you could do. I might come in here and want to tweak this and not say everything's 5%. I might say it's 10%. But it says, hey, dummy, you can't have a split that's more than 100%. Fix that, because I can do conditional formatting. And I can do the same thing for colors. So now I've got this really, really built-out view where I can do a high-level forecast and add in other inputs that would help me divide this up into the very, very granular details that I need to get into. And if we go into the data model, we've got that actually kind of set up here. So you see we pull in, we've got our template that we calculated using PowerPivot over to the left. And then we're starting to pull in the inputs. We've got a product input, and you can see a DAX formula there that is essentially doing the equivalent of a SUMIF. We've got a long table with our product inputs already living in our file thanks to PowerQuery, or already living in our model. Now I'm essentially going to do a bunch of SUMIFs to say, hey, go grab the product input that aligned with this particular product, this particular color, et cetera, et cetera. I can do the same for my table of geography split percentages, the same for my color mix. And now, if I wanted to, I could also sort of say, hey, I want to do a table of really detailed adjustments. I know like the Seahawks in October are going to order blue and green pants, so I want to up my forecast for just those blue and green pants. Maybe in Excel, I have a table for doing those kind of detailed adjustments, and I get it all into my model. Which means in the end, my forecast starts to look like a really simple formula, right? My input times 1% times another percentage, maybe plus something else. Now I've got a long, detailed forecast when I haven't necessarily had to care about every little individual input. And you know, the level at which you go through to even those geo mixes or color mixes are all sort of up to the analyst what they care about. But the point is, and one thing we really flew through here is this table itself is 60,000 rows. It could have been longer if we had more detailed work we needed to do. But across those different columns, we were doing a bunch of different SUMIFs on lots of different tables effectively. So if you thought about running a bunch of SUMIFs on a few columns, on a few thousand, or 60,000 rows, you wouldn't be clicking through and flying through really quickly as you look at these different data points. You know, everything might sort of hang a little bit. You do a little bit of recalculating. But within PowerPivot, it's no problem to do. So now you can actually get to some of the meaty stuff in PowerPivot, where you start doing DAX formulas, building out measures to help bridge this all together. Because essentially what we had done was we had come up with the forecast, we had come up with the inputs, but now what we want is a way to sort of hide all of that and do the nitty-gritty, which is I want a general model, right? I want to have a forecast. I want to have a way of looking at both my previous sales and my outlook as one cohesive data set to say maybe what am I really saying I'm going to do in terms of year-over-year growth or other trends or KPIs that you might be looking at. So you might have a simple DAX formula to go and calculate actuals, and you might have one that can simply calculate your model inputs. But what you want is something that combines those two, that big box. But that's also not hard to do with DAX. I can use my timetable as a way of saying, well, previous months should always rely on actuals. Future months should rely on the model as a way of building out a new measure. And if you see that in a pivot, it looks like this. Really easy and simple to understand. Our model sales becomes our new sort of North Star in doing everything else within the model, because it knows when to pick up actuals or when to pick up a combination of all these different inputs I've done. And because all the tables are connected with my different hierarchies and my different grouping tables, everything sort of works together really easily. And then I can do more advanced stuff. I can do a measure that says, well, here's model sales for 1 year, but what does it look like for a prior year? So you can see that everything flows down sort of down and to the right. A prior year calculation for FY14 is essentially the FY13 number. But that makes year over year a really simple calculation to do, right? It's just subtraction. It makes the year over year percentage a really simple equation to do because it's just division. These are all so much easier or so important because it's all built within the model. It's all built within the pivots or however else you might be accessing the data. The most important point here is, to me, it didn't matter what data point you were interested in. If we were interested in what's the forecast for year-over-year growth for black T-shirts coming out of the Pacific Northwest, I didn't need to anticipate that and set up my table for it, right? We can just go drill down to whatever we care about at any given moment and do that work or find out the number that we're interested in and potentially update our forecast as a result or update our budget target as a result. You could do the same thing with loading in prior information, right? So I might have done this 3 months ago, a quarter ago, and have a prior forecast. So I could just do a copy-paste, make that a part of my model, and make it really easy to do variances to the prior forecast. That's something really common for us. A lot of times we'll have a conversation and say, well, I think we're going to do $5 million in December, and the question is, well, what did we think 3 months ago? Did we already tell people we were going to do $5 million, or is that good news we should be like really screaming at the top of our lungs? But you can even get really, really a lot more interesting. This is where the KPIs get fun. This is where the data measures get fun. Because we're in a clothing industry. We might have something important for, say, our lead of accessories, right? They're in charge of pushing belts, and maybe an important metric for them is how do we sell belts relative to our pants and our shorts? We should have some sort of attach rate that 50% of our pants sales always get a belt added to them. Super easy, again, to write measures that say, filter down our model sales to only items that have pants, or only items that have shorts, or only belts. And then our attach rate becomes, again, a simple division that as you manipulate the data, as you play with it, as you're, most importantly, adding new inputs, you can quickly re-access them. One that's really, really common for Microsoft now as we move into a subscription business for lots of different parts of or lots of different products is what we call a churn rate. So how is your subscriptions 1 year from your existing customers compare to the subscriptions of the prior year? So you might say something like this, where you divide your customer set into essentially new subscriptions and existing subscriptions. And ideally, you want your existing subscriptions to always be as much as your total subscriptions from the previous year. Because if it's less than that, that means you've lost customers or you've lost a potential revenue source. And so we look at what we call a churn rate. How much did you actually lose in your existing customer set from your total base of the prior year? And you want to see it drop down. So you could do a manual calculation just like this. Pretty simple to say 1 minus 2 items over the other. Or you can write a measure, which is now this is the exact same numbers, but we're in a pivot. So if we did filtering, we would see all these numbers update. Now it becomes a core part of my forecast as I play with numbers, as I do inputs, to now say, well, what does this mean for our churn rate? And maybe what does it mean for our churn rate for t-shirts? Or what does it mean for our churn rate for black t-shirts in Florida? All of that is now native to my experience, can easily be worked in to my forecasting process without me having to do advanced planning about what are those metrics that I might want to look at or which areas might I want to drill down on. So that also means that you can do stuff like build out a summary, build out a dashboard that's got new Excel visualizations, and see how all these different things visually are also impacted when you start playing with your inputs. And so the natural question might be, well, you're starting to do a dashboard, do you push this out to Power BI? And it could be that that's the final location of this. But we're still in an iterative process here, right? I'm in the middle of a forecast. I'm not pushing out to Power BI as I'm still trying to determine what that forecast is, or as I'm playing with my inputs, or as I'm deciding that maybe we need to do a greater share of black shirts versus white shirts. But the point is, all of this is still connected to a data model, which means I'm ready with all these really, really detailed information data points to go have an executive level conversation about what we think we're going to do in the next 12 months, what we're going to do on a particular data set. And again, everything is available there for me to drill down on. So I can start focusing in on maybe just our forecast. And if I went down to July and do our t-shirts or wherever else we wanted to go, what would we see impacted? And all those trends, all those KPIs we were looking at, like our belt attach rate, like our churn rate, all become items that we can get more interested in. And they're all interactive charts as part of Excel 15. So maybe I want to drill down on the East and suddenly see, well, within the East region, our churn rates look pretty different across our different districts. So this all happens because we've done the work to do it built into our data in the background. We're just at about time there. So just want to clarify what we've been able to do by combining this all together. Simple visualizations makes it easier to do the trends and the KPIs, more time for the business insight. So I want to say thank you to all. I'm happy to hang out here or outside, I guess, and answer questions if you want to talk a little bit more about the DAX and stuff. We're pretty much at time. The other point I wanted to land is, We've got the Ask Their Experts section out there where you can talk to some of the Excel engineering team if you've got questions. We're going to be doing feedback sessions. You can look for Sophia out by the ballroom. She's going to be taking feedback on the Excel product. And one other quick item I want to throw out there is we have the Excel user voice, which is a place where we look to the Excel community to give feedback on the product, for us to make updates to the product. Really go out there and give us your thoughts on new things you'd like to see in Excel. We review those all the time and look for new ways to improve the product. Thank you.